It's good to be in the house of the Lord today, is it not? It's good to have the bearded stranger back. Where'd he go? Over there. For those of you who don't know, Tim used to lead music here. And then he shaved his beard and became Timmy.
I promise to never do that again.
We are grateful. Yeah. It was great to have him in and talk to him Friday night. His classes are going well at Southwestern, and so is his wives, Rustina's, and so they're enjoying their time there. If you brought your Bibles with me, if you'll turn to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. Starting in verse 1. Exodus chapter 2. Move here. Exodus chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. And the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that the child was a fine child, she said to him, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. And while her young women walked beside the river, she saw a basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman. And she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. And she took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse from one of the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take the child away, nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and when the child grew older, she brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of water. Let's pick up here. We've been seeing over the last couple of weeks Pharaoh's plan, his final solution to the Jews in his land, because they had grown to such a size that they terrified him as a possible ally to any invader. And we saw at first he thought that if he made them slaves and persecuted them, that they would, stop having kids. And apparently that didn't work. And they grew and multiplied. So he then decided to elicit the aid of the midwives to be complicit in his grand plan. And so he told them, hey, when a mother is birthing and you see that it's a male, kill it. Put it to death. And the Hebrew midwives, if you were here last week, kind of told a rather large whopper. I don't understand how Pharaoh bought this, because I didn't buy it. I read it and went, Hebrew women are so much better at giving childbirth. They're so more durable. They're so much stronger. That kid comes out of the womb walking, and by the time we show up, the kid's mom and kid are gone. And so then he finally came up with his last option, and this is where we bring ourselves today, where he orders the people that if you have a male child, that the Egyptians are to take the child and throw the child into the Nile River and kill the child. And one of the interesting things that scholars kind of look at in this, they go, well, from possibly the Egyptian perspective, when you think about this, instead of Pharaoh saying, well, we're going to kill these children by running them through with a spear, which would be far much easier. I mean, think about it. You find the child, you stab the child dies, you walk away. You let the mom and dad clean it up. We're going to take the babies, we're then going to go down to the river, and we're going to throw the babies into the river. A little bit more steps to that. I almost went on a rabbit trail about Baptists and Methodists, but we won't chase that joke. Put it over. I'm just going to start calling out numbers, and those will be my jokes. So it's far more easier just when they find the child, they stab the child and leave the child there. He comes up with this plan to throw the child into the Nile. And one of the rationales behind that is what Pharaoh might have been thinking is, well, I'm going to leave it up to the Nile god. If the Nile god wants these children to live, they'll live. If he doesn't want these children to live, they'll die. And it's kind of like when I said, I'm going to put a pie right there. And I'm just going to walk towards it. going, and if the pie gets eaten, it's the pie's fault. And it's the pie's fault that I got fat for eating it. Now, we kind of don't really fall for that kind of logic, but that's one of some folks kind of look at this and they go, well, it's possible that that is what he's trying to do. And there's some sense in that, and there's some evidence to support that. And so we'll look at that as a possibility of what Moses' mom is trying to do. But notice what happens. Typical way in which spouses meet. A man from one house runs into a woman from another house. They meet, they get married, baby comes along. Notice that the child is a fine-looking child. This seems a bit of an odd description because have you ever met a mother, I have never met a mother, that did not think that their child was the prettiest thing on the earth? I have seen a lot of babies. I've seen a lot of beautiful babies. And then I've seen a lot of babies. And publicly will decry that every baby I see is the most beautiful child I've ever seen in my life. But there are some that go, I hope she grows into that head, or more for humor's sake. Now, my kids were the most beautiful children that exist. But then again, I'm their dad. So, but every mother thinks their child is a fine child. I've dealt with parents when I worked with youth that the kid pulls a knife, he cuts me across the chest, the cops take the kid away. Mama's going, my child. Yes, it was your child. Yeah, talk to a teacher. There's a couple of them here where the kid is caught red-handed with everything, and mom comes in and goes, not my child. Yeah, actually, it was your child. There were 40 witnesses. There's a bit of a blind. So the thing that the text mentions that the child is a fine-looking child, usually when the text gives you this information, it's not free. It's going to help aid the understanding later on. When Pharaoh's daughter opens the basket, think about it. When Pharaoh's daughter opens the basket, whoa, that's a beautiful-looking baby. So that information is there to aid the story and a little bit later on. But notice what goes on. She has the child. She tries to keep the child for 3 full months. I really don't understand how you think that you're going to hide a baby for 3 months. When Caroline was a young baby, Caroline would only sleep when I sat in a rocking chair for a year, because she was born 36 hours after I got home from my first deployment. And so I slept the first year of her birth in a rocking chair doing this at nighttime. And if I finally got to where I rocked myself to sleep and I stopped rocking that chair, she would wake up and then proceed to wake me up. And then I went like this for 12 long months. And I remind her of that when just like my mom reminded me, did I tell you how long I was in labor with you? 12 long, painful, yeah, okay. But babies are not necessarily known for being quiet, right? Those of you with babies, and all of a sudden none of the babies are crying right now. That was a great point for you as children to start crying. Anyhow, but they're not known necessarily for being quiet. They're not necessarily known for necessarily being covert. Why? Because they have that weird habit of crying at the time where you want to sleep. Typically is when everything else is quiet. And so she tries to hide the child, and she realizes she cannot. And what some have alluded to is as they began looking for the Hebrew children to throw them into the Nile, that the area in which she lived became more and more contained with individuals intent on finding babies. Because think about it. When you hear a baby cry at night, it kind of starts off, especially if you live in government housing, starts off somewhere in a far distant spot, and then it begins to pinpoint where you're at. The text, this is all surmised from text, but she gets to the point where she believes she cannot keep this child. And then what happens is she does something that a lot of liberals like to say is a common practice. We'll look at it. She takes the child, she puts it in a basket, and she puts the child into the river, if you boil it down. And in the ancient Near Eastern world, what you would do is if you had an ugly child, or you had a child with a deformity, or you had a child that you didn't think would be survivable. This is common amongst the Greeks. This is very common. The Romans practiced this, and a lot in the ancient Eastern world practices. They would practice the art of exposure. Not like take the clothes off the kid and go, ah! Exposure is when they take the child out into nature and leave the child. And then they go home. And so the way a lot of liberals will approach this is, well, what she is doing, she realizes she can't keep the child. She understands the child is beautiful. And so, but she also understands that if she's caught, understand the penalty for being caught here is not simply that they're going to kill the child, but the implied task is guess who else's life is on the line? Mom, Dad, and the other two, because we know Moses has his brother Aaron and his sister. And so what they argue is what she does is she takes the child and she goes to the river and exposes the child to the natural dangers within the river. The thing tips over, the baby drowns, now a crocodile comes along, baby dies, whatever. The problem is that doesn't fit with the care that is given in the text. If you were going to expose the child to the crocodiles or to the river or to the things like that, would you take time to select a basket made of bulrushes that would float, and then it'll text you this butament. It's really slime. It's this sticky, nasty stuff that can, like slime. Have you ever used the green slime for your car? Kind of like that stuff. Not really like that stuff because that's a chemical, but kind of like that stuff because it's waterproof. And they take it and they mix it with pitch and they seal the basket up to where the basket floats. Now, if you were going to expose the child to the elements, would you take the care to make a basket that would not sink? Would you take the time then to take the child to the river, to a safe place within the river, a place where it's quite possibly known that the daughter of Pharaoh will come and bathe on a regular basis there, and place the child within the river? If you were going to expose the child to the elements so the child would die, would you then post the boy's sister to watch to see what happens? No, because you're going to expose the child to the elements. You really don't care if the child lives. And notice that all the actions here involve the child living. The fact that the basket is designed to float. By the way, the word there translated, you can make it can translate to the word ark, not the same similar word as the big ark, not necessarily the same concept. So that's why we use the word basket. Put the child in a basket so it will float. If I was going to expose a child to the elements, would I put a covering over the child so the child would be protected from the sun? All this is designed to show the love that the mom has for this child and the belief in God to preserve this child. Remember, last week we noticed that the means of destruction that Pharaoh has chosen to eliminate the Jews is going to be the means of deliverance for God's people. The same Nile that they're tossing these babies into will be the same Nile that Moses is pulled out of. The same Nile that these children meet their maker in, either through drowning, being eaten by crocodiles, or what have you, or other things that crawl in there, is the same Nile by which Moses is going to be drawn out of and then go into Pharaoh's house. Notice if you look behind all of this action, you see the hand of God providentially making this event come to its climax. Think about it. It's a basket. It's not very big. Imagine a basket with a baby in it sitting in a river. Baby starts rolling around. Guess what the basket does? Tips over. So we see what goes on here. We're seeing how God is making this happen. Because if you can sit and look at it and go, well, look at this. It's an amazing sense of coincidence. Amazing set of coincidences that she finds a basket, she puts the child in the basket, she makes the basket where it doesn't float, but anywhere along the way, can the child be discovered? Yes. As she's taking the child to the river, the child can be discovered. As she is putting the child into the river, the child can be discovered and then thrown into the water. All along the way, the opportunity for failure to occur just through natural working. But yet we see God's providential hand working in this. The baby goes into the water. The daughter is placed there. By chance, check this out, by chance, just on a whim, Pharaoh's daughter decided to come down to that part of the river. She came down, and the young woman walked beside the river, and she saw a basket among the reeds, and her servant woman took it and opened it. So the child is in the river. The sister is watching from a distance. Pharaoh's daughter comes and takes a bath, sees the basket. Now, what is Pharaoh's daughter under the command for? If you see a Hebrew male, what are you to do with it? Kill it! So you see the child within the river. She sees the child. They open the basket. She sees that the child is a fine child and has pity upon the child. And the implication of that pity is what about the child? That the child will be delivered. Now look at how this works out. She opens the basket. She looks. The baby is crying. Here's one of, she knows who the child is. Take a look at this. She knows exactly whose child this is. This is one of the Hebrew children. She didn't have to think about it. She knew what she had. She knew what the command was. Now you go back to the understanding, and then when you look at how his name comes into existence, you go back to the understanding about how, if you are allowing the river to make the decision for you, that you find this child and you go, hey, the Nile God allowed this child to live, and therefore I drew him out of the water, and that's why he is my son. And so you have scholars that kind of go in that vein. But notice what she does. She picks the child up. His sister comes forward and says, hey, would you like me to go get a nursemaid for this child? Listen, I'm not telling you information that's not in the text. I'm probably not even telling you information that you haven't already heard preached to you. She goes, and notice what happens. Miriam goes and gets who? Mama. And the child she has, she gets to raise during very preformative years. In the Hebrew custom, typically weaning process was 3 to 5 years. You see this in the story with Hannah, that they hold on to the children. They wean their children off much later than we do today. And so she has the child for 3 to 5 years, some estimates would say, to teach this child very much who this child is. To love this child and instill within this child an understanding of where the child comes from. And then at the end of the 5 years, she takes the child back to his adopted mother, and she names him Moses because he's drawn from the water. You say, that's great. That's great. Pretty straightforward. It is. You see passages like this in much of the Old Testament, where the thing we want, or the thing that we have, is the thing that we are required to give up. You go and look at the story of Abram. Abram is told that he will have a child, he will have a descendant, and through that descendant, a great nation will be formed. And then no sooner as after the child is born, God looks at Abram and says, hey, guess what? I want you to take Isaac, I want you to take some wood, and I want you to take some fire, and I want you to go to this place, and I want you to kill him and burn him to me. And what does Abraham say to the servants before he leaves? Wait here. I and the child will return. Because Abraham understood that God would be faithful enough to preserve that child, even if Abraham takes this knife and stabs it into the chest and then sacrifices the child, then God would raise that child back. You see this with Hannah in 1 Samuel. She prays and prays and prays for a child, and to the point where the priest looks at her and says, woman, you're drunk. And she says, no, I've been praying for a child. And she receives a child. And then after she obtains the very thing that she wants, she fills her vow and gives it to the Lord and visits that child once a year and brings the child a new set of clothes. Mama wants to keep the child. But after 3 months realizes that keeping the child is not tenable. And so she does this very act in a hope that the Lord will preserve this child. She turns over the very thing that she wishes to have in the hope that God will honor this, protect the child, and then raise the child. And notice what God does with the sacrifice of what she does. She then takes the child back, is able to nurse the child and train the child. Notice the one thing that she wanted to have, she had to give away, and then it returns back to her little bit later on. And we approach the text sometimes this way with a very formulaic passage and go, well, because that happened with Abraham, if I give something up, then God will give it back to me and it'll be a greater reward. Or because Hannah did this, God will bless her. And we approach it very, very formulaic way. The problem is it's not a formula. Abram's not sitting there calculating the risk reward of, if I give God my son, how much more will I get versus how much will I want? The fact of the matter is, though, in order for Moses to be drawn from the water, Moses must go into the water. In order for Moses to be the deliverer of his people, he must be in a position where that is feasible and tenable. As a slave, he doesn't have any rights, nor can he flee very easily. As a high member of Pharaoh's household, he can flee and leave Egypt and really be unquestioned. As a future writer of the 5 books of the Old Testament, first 5, the education value he will have from being a son of Egypt is greater than any value of being a son of a brickmaker. All of this stuff is being providentially worked by God behind the scene to bring about the deliverance of his children by the faith of a woman who's faithful enough to put the child into a river and hope that the Lord will guide him safely there. What do you hold on to? Have you ever noticed that the more we hold on to things that the Lord has asked us to give up, the harder and harder it is to hold on to them? Have you ever noticed that the one thing that you want and you've asked the Lord for it, and amazingly you get it, and then soon afterwards you feel the Lord asking you to turn that over, and you desire to hold on to it to the point that you begin to hold on to such a tenacious statue that you feel it slipping away? There's a Welsh proverb that says, "He who controls everything controls nothing." We work hard, we dedicate our lives to earning money, and we begin to amass a small amount of wealth for our house and for our family. And then when we're asked to do things with that for the Lord, we look at it and go, "Lord, I trust you in all things." But not that. And it's recognized in the amount at times we tithe. We recognize who our God is by how we tithe. Or, "Lord, I trust you with everything in my house to include my money, but my family time. I trust you with everything in my house except for my business life, my personal life. I'm willing to come to church and act the Christian and act the individual, but I'm not willing to give that over to you." See, Moses' mother was willing to put the child into the river in the hopes that the Lord would watch over the child and protect the child. If she didn't believe that the Lord was going to protect the child, what would have stopped her from just slam dunking the child into the Nile? All those actions show a type of hope, of provision. We hold on to things. We look at God and say, "I can trust you with these things, but not this. I can trust you with this part of my life, but I'm not going to trust you with this part of my life." What are you holding on to? If you sat and looked in your life and looked at the examples of your life and say, "Am I sold out enough that I could lay upon the altar of the Lord the very thing I value most, in the hopes that the Lord will bring that back, or that the Lord will reward through that faith, or that the Lord's reward for that is in the future when I go to the other side of glory? Or is there things that I hold on to and mount that I would put it all?" Remember that hymn? We love to sing this hymn. "All to Jesus I surrender. All to Him I freely give." Our actions don't match that song. "Most to Jesus I surrender. All to Him I would grudgingly give," if we were to sing it honestly, myself included. And there are things you're like, "Oh, God, I know you have been faithful in times past. I know you've been faithful and will continue to be faithful, but man, I don't know if I could trust you with that." That's an interesting conversation you're having with the Lord now, isn't it? She puts the child into the river knowing there's a good chance of failure for this mission. And yet has the faith that the Lord will bring this child safely out. Where is your faith in regard to the things you have? See, because we don't have someone saying every male child is going to be tossed into the Brazos. Every male child is going to go tossed into Stillhouse Hollow Lake. We don't have anything like that. But we do have things in our lives by which we hold tenaciously to. It reflects on two things. First of all, it reflects on how big your God is. And it reflects how big your understanding of faith is. Abram knows, because God makes a promise, that that child will live again. Hannah knows, because God has fulfilled the promise, that she will see that child, and that child is dedicated unto the Lord. The Old Testament is full of these passages. What things do you have that you cannot place upon the altar and say, of this I would give to the Lord and walk away? That's a hard conversation for me. I'm sure it's a hard conversation for you. But in this situation here, she put her child there. And unlike in the case with Abram, God doesn't stop her and say, pull that basket out. There's Pharaoh's daughter about a mile down the road. Give her the basket to her. She's going to, whoop, there goes my mic. I heard that, Miss Van. When I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. Pharaoh's daughter's a mile down the road. Take the basket to her. I've made provision. Now, a lot of times they come back and attack this story by saying this story about Moses is very similar to an ancient Near Eastern story about another individual from another part of the land. There are always ancient Near Eastern stories that are similar to that of those within the Bible, and they all coincidentally happen to be written long before all the other events in the Bible. I actually had one person argue with me that there are stories older than the creation event within the Bible. I want you to think really hard about that statement. There are stories older than the account of the creation event. Stories older than creation itself. That's an old story. No? Didn't work? Okay. I'll start telling football jokes a little bit more. Tony Romo! There we go. What they do is they take these stories and they begin to try to peel them back. Why? Because the supernatural nature of stories like this are frightening to individuals. The supernatural nature of how God delivers this child into the hand of an individual who is bound by duty and by order to murder the child, yet pulls the child out of the river and raises the child as his own, or her own. Mother gets the child back. We look at this story and we go, that's a cute story. It's a great story. I heard it in Sunday school. That's nice. And we have a cursory understanding with it. And we don't interact with the other side of that story, which is, what are you afraid to place upon the altar and to put into the hands of God? Well, I'm sold out for Jesus, are you? Go and examine that life and see how sold out you are. Go look at the things you hold tenaciously to and ask yourself, could I simply put it, if it's finances, could I put it in the offering plate and walk away and never begrudge that I did it? If it was time, could I give it to the Lord and not begrudge the service that I give unto the Lord? If it's the whatever it is, my wealth, my cars, my house, my home, my totality of my being, because there are some of you here that are riding the fence and say, I am not ready to dedicate my entire life to being sold out for the Lord, then who's God in your life? See, He's either God of all of it, or He really is God of none of it. Because when you start parceling out what you're going to give Him to rule over and what you're going to maintain to rule over, you have basically told Him He is not who He claims He is. And you are His co-equal. What do you hold back and not freely put at the altar and walk away? What keeps you from doing that thing? And ask yourself, why? If you're here today and say, I have not fully decided, I have yet to comprehend, I wrestle with the understanding of who God is and why I should let Him be the author and the perfecter of my faith, that I should turn my life over freely to Him and let Him run things. I think I'm doing a pretty good job. I'd like to sit and talk to you about the loving kindness of our God the Father, who guides an innocent, helpless child into the path that He wants the child to be on, to bring the child from the river to where the child can deliver his people to safety. The story parallels very nicely with the Christ event. A humble nature of a child coming into the world, being born in a manger, being pursued by the authorities for his death, protected by his family, who then, as he grows, becomes the deliverer not just of a race of people, not just of a nation of people, but of a totality of a world that would gladly, in their sinful state, yell, "Crucify Him, crucify Him, crucify Him." Yet in spite of that, hangs on your tree for your crime. As the praise band comes to sing, if you will please stand.